Pat Iyer here, host of Legal Nurse Podcast. In this upcoming series of podcasts, I'll be sharing with you some specific shows about working on forensic cases. Legal nurse consultants can serve criminal defense attorneys and criminal prosecutors in a variety of ways, and our programming is designed to bring some of those concepts to you. Be sure to check out the conference that is coming up May 30, 31, and June 1st, 2024, called Murder Mysteries Unraveled. This is a 3-day conference highlighting a variety of topics to give you the skills that you need to effectively consult on criminal cases. You'll meet a variety of experts and participate in activities that will open up your eyes to the opportunities that exist to get your foot in the door in this field or to get more cases from attorneys who are handling criminal cases. Look for that link at the end of the video and also right below here, which is lnc.tips/murder. Now for the show. This is both an audio program and a video program. The video is found on our YouTube channel, which is Legal Nurse Business. Hi, this is Legal Nurse Podcast. I'm Pat Iyer. Today, I'm going to do a little bit of a different podcast for you. We're focusing this month on the topic of murder. Our conference coming up on May 30, 31, and June 1st deals exclusively with various aspects of how a legal nurse consultant helps an attorney with a case involving murder. I'm going to share with you in this podcast the story of Charles Cullen, who is a nurse in New Jersey and Pennsylvania who killed between 400 and 1,000 or more patients over a 16-year period. You may have read the book, The Good Nurse. You may have seen the movie, The Good Nurse. I will share with you today some details about my work as a consultant, helping one of the prosecutors involved in pinpointing which patients Charles Cullen killed in the facility in their county. For your best enjoyment of this program, you may wish to watch this on my YouTube channel, where you'll see the slides that I'll be referring to. And if you're listening to this on the audio channel, no worries. I will describe to you the slides as I'm going through. Charles Cullen started off his nursing career in June 1987. His first job was at St. Barnabas Medical Center. He was a new graduate. He was employed in the only certified burn unit in New Jersey. And he liked his job. He had gotten married shortly after graduation to Adrienne, and they bought a small house on the edge of New Jersey across the state from St. Barnabas Medical Center. He began drinking in the basement and was quite depressed. After a while, his wife became pregnant in their first year of their marriage. His relationship with his wife started to crack. One day when she went out to work, when she came home, the puppy was gone. She asked Charles, where was the dog? And he said, oh, the dog must have disappeared. It wandered away. I was out taking a walk while our baby was sleeping. She said, what do you mean? You left the house when the baby was inside? And you must have left the door open if the dog got out? How could you do that? He didn't really have an adequate explanation for what had happened to that puppy. However, shortly thereafter, the neighbor's dog was found dead and poisoned. He ultimately fathered 2 children. He continued to work at St. Barnabas Medical Center until February 11th, 1991, something began to change. A pharmacy nurse brought a suspicious IV bag to the nurse manager. The port on the bag looked like it had been used. The bag was full to the point that it was bursting. The nurse manager got in touch with the hospital's assistant director of security, a former policeman named Thomas Arnold, who took the IV bag to the lab, and they confirmed that it contained insulin. I was involved in investigating the cases at this hospital and saw the reports that indicated that there were 4,000 units of insulin in this IV bag. That bag had been hung on a patient whose blood sugar started to plummet. When they turned the IV off, the patient recovered. When they turned it back on, the patient's blood sugar dropped again. A few days later, a second patient had the same reaction, and this bag again came back positive with insulin in it. The former policeman and the nurse manager looked at these patient records in the burn unit to see if anyone else had experienced unexplained insulin crashes. They found patients were crashing with regularity, and the codes had become so frequent that the code team was running from one code to the next. The patients had unprecedented levels of insulin in their bloodstream. At first, they assumed that somebody had made a mistake, but in further investigation, the vice president of the hospital decided to interview several nurses about this incident. Charles was the only one who didn't seem to be nervous. He refused to answer questions, even after he was accused of putting something in the bags. The head of security and the vice president went to the police in Livingston, where the hospital was located, and they became suspicious and tried to catch him in the act. The policeman said, "There's not enough evidence to charge this guy." The hospital decided to stop giving shifts to Charles, and the frequent codes and the hypoglycemic episodes disappeared when he left the position. Charles went home and told his wife that there had been an internal investigation and somebody was putting insulin in the IV bags in the storage room. He couldn't imagine who would be doing such a thing, and told her with great gusto that it was not possible to detect IV bags that had been tampered with. He decided to get a job down the road at Warren Hospital. This was closer to where he lived. He gave his dates of employment at St. Barnabas. He gave them permission for them to contact St. Barnabas for a reference, and he said he wanted to have a job closer to where he lived. He continued to drink. He was depressed. He refused to stop drinking. Ultimately, his wife decided to get a divorce and hired a process server who gave him divorce papers at work. His wife agreed that he could move out of the house as soon as he could afford it, but they would continue to live together until they could work out the details. She regretted this decision almost immediately. Charles made a suicide attempt in January of 1993. He ultimately made about 20 suicide attempts, often by taking pills and then making sure that the door was unlocked so that the rescue squad could come in. He made the 911 call and waited for their arrival. When he was working at the ICU and made the suicide attempt, he was first transferred to that same ICU in Warren Hospital and then to Muhlenberg Hospital in Pennsylvania to a psychiatric unit. There was a nurse from Warren Hospital who began visiting him while he was in the psychiatric facility, and he became a stalker. He found out she liked brownies. He would bring brownies to work every day for her. He would come to work when she was working, and he was off. He ultimately brought out a ring, wanted to propose to her. She was not interested. He broke into her home one night by throwing a rock through the window of the door and entered her home to watch her sleep. He admitted that act. He got a police record that led to another suicide attempt. And this time he was taken to Greystone Psychiatric Hospital, which was known as Greystone Lunatic Asylum. Greystone was where I had my psychiatric nursing experience when I was in nursing school. It was at that time an 8,000-bed hospital. During the 1970s, 1980s, they began releasing patients from Greystone. It still had a substantial patient population at the time that Charles was admitted there. And he liked it. He liked getting all of the attention that came with being a patient at Greystone. One day he was a patient at Greystone Hospital when he got a phone call. Patients didn't have telephones in their room, so he got a call from the Warren Hospital switchboard, and they put it through to him, asking when he was available so that he could return to Warren ICU. As long as a psychiatrist had cleared him for work, they wanted him back. He headed right back to the night shift. A couple months after he returned to Warren, he zeroed in on a patient named Helen Dean. She was scheduled to go home the following day. Her son never seemed to leave the bedside. Charles took a syringe with 1.5 milligrams of digoxin, asked the son to leave the room, and injected Helen in the thigh. When her son returned to the room, Helen said to her son, "He hurt me." She became ill and her heart stopped. She died. Larry Dean called the Warren County prosecutor and said his mother had been murdered, and he told them who had done it. Charles was questioned by the doctor, by administrators, his supervisors, 2 people from the prosecutor's office. He denied everything. The medical examiner's office decided to test Helen's thigh and tested it for 100 potentially lethal chemicals, but they did not test for digoxin. Charles' supervisor informed him he would be put on indefinite paid leave, and he was to leave immediately. He went home. He was depressed. He decided that he would attempt to commit suicide again and was again admitted to an inpatient psychiatric unit. This time, he decided to move a little bit further south in New Jersey to Hunterton County. This is the county where I live in the summer. He was practicing nursing approximately 20 minutes from my home. Had any of my family members needed ICU care, he would have been the one taking care of them. He worked at Hunterton for 2 years. This community is a small, closely knit one, and he got hired right into the ICU, where his initial performance was strong. He was considered to be intelligent, very giving. He had much to offer. He was very bright. His nursing supervisor, Marjorie Whelan, was impressed with him. And he had no medication errors, according to Marjorie, but we later learned that he did. When asked much later, he said he didn't really remember the names of those he injected and killed, no more than he cared about the reprimands and the write-ups that were now building up in his once perfect personnel file. He over-lubricated his patients, turning them into grease buckets. He was caught administering unprescribed drugs to some patients and withholding essential prescribed drugs from others. Nurse Whelan couldn't figure out what happened to her prize person. Nurse Whelan pulled his charts and found out that he was not making normal mistakes. Whenever he gave the wrong drug to a patient, he also failed to record that drug on the chart. He was even ordering his own lab tests. On the morning of July 19th, 10 days after Charles killed a patient called Jesse Aiken with digoxin, Nurse Whelan pulled him into an empty room for a conference. She couldn't make sense of this pattern. She presented an ultimatum. One more incident and Charles would be terminated. Charles felt that this was a good time to make his exit. He thought he would just simply quit. So he wrote a letter resigning. He forfeited 170 hours of paid vacation time and put that letter in a mailbox. As soon as he dropped it in, he regretted it. Went to the post office and tried to retrieve it, and they couldn't find it, wouldn't give it back to him. And Nurse Whelan gratefully accepted his resignation. After he resigned from Hunterton Medical Center in October of 1996, he simply drove up the road to Morristown Memorial Hospital. This is a large tertiary medical center. It is the place where we considered having my husband's triple bypass done. It was a choice between Morristown or Johns Hopkins, because Morristown does open heart surgery, one of the few places in our area that did. We chose to go to Johns Hopkins instead. Had my husband had open heart surgery, he would have been in the ICU where Charles was working. The people at Morristown Memorial Hospital did check Charles' references. There were several discrepancies in the dates of his employment, but he was willing to work up to 75 hours a week on the night shift in ICU, so they accepted him in. At Morristown, the staff would arrive to find Charles' patients were cowering. They were laying in pools of their own blood. There might be 25 washcloths in the sink. There was junk all over the counter. They would write up these complaints as incidents. One patient told Charles' supervisor he wanted to call the police, but the police weren't called, and Charles got a lecture instead. He knew they were watching him. He knew that they had it in for him. He believed they noticed the pattern, especially with the drugs he was administering, and that he appeared careless several times, loading patients with the wrong dose of Diprovan or heparin. He was there for less than a year before they fired him, not for killing a patient, but for poor performance and nurse practice issues, and the patients were complaining. After he was fired, he tried committing suicide again and bounced right back to Greystone Hospital for another 2-month admission, leaving a record behind of being fired in 1997 for these errors that were on his record. He applied to work across the border in Pennsylvania. He was living very close to Pennsylvania, and along the Delaware River, which separates Pennsylvania and New Jersey, there are several hospitals lining the river on the Pennsylvania side. He applied for a job at Liberty Healthcare Rehabilitation Services through a staffing agency, and he required references. When Liberty Healthcare contacted Morristown Memorial Hospital, they simply confirmed that he had worked there. They provided no other references. His reference from Hunterton Medical Center was different. Marjorie Whelan, his supervisor, told Liberty that he was an excellent nurse, he gave good care, and he was excellent with patients. Relying on that recommendation for employment, Liberty brought Charles into the ICU. In the ICU at Liberty, he took care of a patient named Francis Henry, who was in a halo device. He believed that Mr. Henry should be in a hospital rather than in a nursing home ICU, and he injected insulin directly into Henry's IV. He quickly spiraled into diabetic shock and was transferred after seizures and a coma to the hospital. When he returned and died the next day, they found massive amounts of insulin in his system. Liberty didn't know where he had gotten this insulin that was not prescribed for him, and they targeted a different nurse and fired her. She claimed very strenuously that she was not responsible for this patient's death. Liberty denied they had any suspicion it was about Charles Cullen. The nurse ultimately got a confidential settlement with the facility, but Liberty demoted him from the ICU to the psychiatric unit. On October 1st, he was seen entering the room of an elderly woman who was not his patient, and he delivered drugs that were not prescribed. There was some type of a scuffle, and the patient ended up with a broken wrist. He was fired for failing to follow the drug protocol. Within 2 days, he had another job, this time at Easton Hospital, where he was hired to work the night shift. On the night shift and in ICU, deaths were never completely unexpected. At Easton Hospital, the daughter of a patient remembers that a nurse said that he was going to take her father out of his room for some tests. The nurse was carrying a syringe, which he said he would use in case her father's heart stopped. The daughter was a nurse. She didn't believe her father had any issues with his heart, but she wasn't the professional taking care of her father. She accepted it. The next time she saw her father, he looked unwell, and she received a call from the father's GP, who was shaken. He said that somebody in the hospital had ordered a series of unauthorized blood tests for her father, which had turned up the fact that he had digoxin, a drug that the GP had never prescribed. The levels were off the chart. The doctor called back to inform the daughter that her father was dead and said, "Please listen to what I'm about to tell you. When you get to the hospital, they'll ask you if you want an autopsy performed. If I were you, I would say yes because of the digoxin." The daughter agreed, despite Charles telling her, "You don't need to have an autopsy done on your father." And it confirmed that there was a lethal amount of unprescribed digoxin. It was ruled an accidental death, and the autopsy was turned over to the county coroner. By the time they started asking questions, Charles was gone and already had a full-time job at Lehigh Valley Hospital, where he was a full-time nurse in the ICU. He got a job in the burn unit, and he got introduced to the Pyxis machine, which ultimately became both his best friend and eventually brought him down. If you're not familiar with the term Pyxis machine, this is an electronic drug cart that dispenses drugs once you put in a code in order to open up a drawer. Charles considers himself to be a veteran nurse. He didn't like the attitude of the nurses towards him. They treated him like a freshman. During the night shifts, he continued to do what he had always done, and he could not remember the specifics of how many people he killed over the time that he was at Lehigh Valley. Most people died during his shift. He found that these impulses reduced his stress and that he would feel good for a while. And then after a while, the experiences lost their thrill. He decided to commit suicide again by burning a hibachi inside his basement apartment. He figured he could die from the buildup of the carbon monoxide. But a neighbor noticed this, and he was admitted for a psychiatric treatment and then decided he would go somewhere else. The somewhere else was St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He got a job as an experienced critical care nurse with a $5,000 sign-on bonus. Again, the nurses working with him felt that the night wind was blowing their patients away. Codes were almost constant. They were not ending up well. When the code was called, Charles was often the first person in the room. He hopped onto the bed. He straddled the patient. He loved to do chest compressions. He was enthusiastic about doing codes. And the nurses began to notice something strange, that the unit hardly ever used Pronestal, but it kept coming up short. Every day they had to restock it in the med room, and every night it was gone. For 6 months, they scratched their heads, but they didn't know where it was going. No one investigated Charles. He was disappointed because he was trying to send them a message. He was throwing the drug away every day he worked because he didn't like St. Luke's. On June 1st, he decided to come up with another method of killing patients. This was the indirect route. He became incredibly helpful by setting up IV bags for his fellow nurses. He assisted them with the start of every new IV line. He later helped with the code. He would say to them, "Let me get your bags ready." He loaded them up with medication. He dumped the empty vials and used syringes into the sharps container, and he laid out the IV bags so that his colleagues could find them and hang them on their own patients. One day that month, a nurse noticed that the sharps box was full. She discovered white cardboard boxes of medications, and these were of Vec, which is a powerful paralytic. They found 60 milligrams of the drug had been reconstituted and injected. But where did it go? There was nobody on their unit on a ventilator. They began watching Charles and reported their findings that the sharps box was full again after he left the medication room. The risk management director was called, who started to talk to the hospital attorney about this situation. After Charles returned to work and another batch of drugs was found in the sharps box, the hospital attorney came back to the hospital and questioned Charles, who denied everything. He was not responsible for any of these errors. He had no knowledge. The hospital attorney told him, although the attorney denies saying this, that if Charles resigned, St. Luke's would give him neutral references and the incident wouldn't show up in his records. He had no choice but to accept the deal. 3 days later, after being terminated, he began his first shift at Sacred Heart Hospital. He did not realize that several of the administrators at St. Luke's had been calling around to their colleagues about Charles, saying he was beyond rehiring, but they had not called Sacred Heart. Charles was steered right to the unit, began his orientation right away, but after 2 weeks, he was told, "Don't bother coming back." The termination notice said that he had been terminated because of interpersonal conflicts. The reality is that one of the nurses at Sacred Heart had formerly worked at Easton Hospital, where the suspicious digoxin death occurred with Helen Dean. She told her Sacred Heart co-workers, who then petitioned the administration, and they threatened to quit if they didn't fire Charles. Charles felt that he needed a clean start again, and the only way to get that was to cross the river and return to New Jersey. He got a job at Somerset Medical Center. While he was being hired at Somerset, the administrators at St. Luke's were calling around still to other hospitals, asking whether they had experienced any unusual incidents with Charles Cullen and telling them that Charles could never be rehired. But the individuals who were making these calls did not contact Somerset Medical Center. This hospital is about 35 minutes from my home, and I know some of the people at Somerset Medical Center. He soon became a popular night nurse. He was quick. He started work early. He was efficient. He was always helping other nurses lay out their IV bags. He would help them later with the codes that ensued. He was considered to be such a strong employee that they put his face on a poster, a recruitment poster, and printed out thousands of posters to encourage people to come work at Somerset Medical Center. He became friends with a nurse named Amy Loren, who was a close colleague. She had some cardiac issues, some advanced atrial fibrillation, and panic attacks, and he felt very close to Amy. He never knew how many people he killed at Somerset Hospital, but they began dying in unexpected ways. The hospital instituted a new drug protocol. Nurses had to sign their guess as to how much insulin was left in the multi-dose insulin vials. No one really understood why this was implemented. Charles continued to pick out patients for his special treatment. And all of this began to change after 16 years of nursing practice and working in 9 institutions in 2 states when a patient died from a digoxin overdose. An employee from the pharmacy department called the New Jersey Poison Control Center. She explained that this patient had high levels of digoxin. The pharmacist recorded the call. This was the first phone call to an external regulatory agency in all of Charles' employment history. The pharmacist told the person who called that she had a police matter on her hands. And she explained a little bit more about her concerns. There were 4 deaths, she told them. Digoxin and high insulin levels were involved. When the hospital did not immediately take action to report this to the Department of Health of New Jersey, the pharmacist at the Poison Control Department, the toxicologist, made a phone call to the Department of Health and reported this. And the State Attorney General's office became notified as well. The person in the Poison Control Department talked to the risk manager, whose name is Mary Lund, and told her that somebody was purposefully doing this to the individuals at her hospital. He told her she had a legal obligation to report it, and he reiterated that it was a police matter. Within a week, the hospital attorney, Ray Fleming, came to the hospital, interviewed Charles Cullen about these suspicious deaths, and he denied everything. Charles continued to work, and he continued to kill patients. In October, now this is several months later, the Somerset County prosecutors decided that they needed the assistance of the Major Crimes Division of the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. This is the office that ultimately hired me after Charles was identified as the murderer. And the detectives began interviewing the staff and found a nurse, Amy Loren, the friend of Charles, who was willing to talk with them. She began realizing, given the information that they put in front of her, how Charles was killing patients. She went through the medical records and she went through the Pyxis records, and she was able to pinpoint his target strategies. She was also working with him every day, and she was in a position to observe his behavior. She discovered that he did a couple of primary things. He intercepted medication deliveries. He would position his med cart near the elevators and knew when the pharmacy technicians would be coming up to restock the unit with drugs. Some of those drugs went into the Pyxis cart. Some of them went into Charles' pocket. She also noticed that he was removing drugs from the Pyxis without detection. He would put in an order for Tylenol, but digoxin was in the same drawer as Tylenol. Or he would put in an order for Tylenol and then cancel it, but the drawer would pop open anyway, and he was able to retrieve the medication from the cart that he wanted to give. Pyxis has since changed this software feature so that this can't happen with other people removing drugs from the same drawer. And finally, he left a trail in the electronic hospital record by checking other patients' charts. He was hunting, as Amy said, for people who became his targets. Every time he opened somebody's chart, he left an electronic fingerprint to show that he had been there. If you think about it, in a written paper report, a paper medical record, you don't know who's opened up that record and looked at it. But in an electronic medical record, it is possible to determine who has looked at the medical record. Ultimately, Somerset Medical Center decided to fire Charles, and the same time that he went home to tell his live-in girlfriend that he had been fired, he found out that she was pregnant. After he left, the detectives continued to work with Amy to look at the documentation. They were acting with her in a way to put her in a position as a legal nurse consultant, although she was not in that title, but she was pouring through the records and showing them the patterns of how Charles was able to get away with this. They were able to convince her to wear a wire to see if she could get Charles to confess. Meanwhile, he had accepted a job at Montgomery Hospital in Pennsylvania and was due to start on December 8th. When Amy told the detective where he was headed next, he called the administration, introduced himself as a homicide division detective, and said, "If you want your patients to live, don't let the new hire begin work." Amy accepted the task of being wired and met Charles for a lunch and encouraged him to confess, but he didn't quite get there. The policemen were in a van outside listening, trying to detect what she was saying. There was a lot of background noise. She pushed him pretty hard, but he did not admit that he was the one who was killing the patients. As soon as he left the restaurant, the police pulled him over, took him to prison, took him to the local jail, and then pushed him for about 6 hours to try to get him to confess. He refused to. Then they decided to come up with a different strategy and brought Amy into the room. He was cold. Amy let him wear her sweater. And for the next 7 hours, he confessed to Amy with the detectives present. That revealed the scope of his unimpeded pathway of destruction for 16 years, killing patients. I became aware of Charles Cullen when I got a call from the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, the ones who had broken this case, and they were working in the county where St. Barnabas was located. You may recall that this is the first hospital where Charles worked after he graduated from nursing school. We had some challenges in trying to figure out who he killed. We had a killer. We had patients who died at St. Barnabas. Many of them were critically ill burn patients. Could we pull it together to indicate to the prosecutors which patients we think he killed? I brought in Dr. Cohen, a critical care physician, to help me look at the records. We had fragments of records, The hospital didn't keep all of the medical records for that length of time. Some of them were missing. We had fragments of his personnel file. For the last couple of years that he worked there, I could tell when he worked, on what days, what shifts, but it wasn't a full set of records. The people who were dying were not the ones he was taking care of. He was killing other nurses' patients. And it's not surprising now that I have learned more about his methods that we were unable to see that he was killing his own patients. He wasn't documenting that he was giving these medications. And many of these people were critically ill and expected to die anyway. However, he was observed by staff to be removing IVs bags from their overwrap and then putting them back on the cart. He was observed participating in codes and enthusiastically giving CPR. So based on these concerns and these patterns, we were mulling over and looking and searching for the clues in the medical records. Our investigation came to a stop when Charles sat down with the Essex County Prosecutor's Office and he admitted killing a judge who was a patient at St. Barnabas, as well as several other people. He was tried in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. When his trial took place in Pennsylvania, he was unable to keep quiet. The courtroom was a big marble room and the sound was reverberating off the walls and the floor. He was screaming to the judge, "You must stand down, you must stand down, you're biased, you must stand down." They put duct tape over his mouth and they still couldn't silence him. And this was very disappointing for the families who were giving their victim statements, victim impact statements, because he screamed over them. They wanted to tell him what it meant to lose their father, mother, sister, brother, grandmother, grandfather, and Charles wouldn't stop screaming. He received a sentence of 17 life sentences. Now, could this happen today? This was an arrest that took place in 2003. We have other healthcare serial killers. Dr. Ortiz, at the time I am recording this, in April 2024, he was just sentenced and convicted for killing patients in Texas in a same-day surgery building. He was an anesthesiologist who was caught on this surveillance camera carrying an IV bag and then putting it in the IV cabinet after he had removed it from the wrap. He had a lengthy disciplinary record with the medical board, several domestic violence arrests. He didn't like his neighbor's dog, was in trouble for shooting the dog, and he was disciplined by the Texas Medical Board. He was also fined for not notifying his employees of past disciplinary action. What he did was to remove IV bags from the warming closet. There's a picture of him bending over and pulling bags or putting bags into the warming cabinet after he put medication in the bags. He took off the overwrap, injected the bags with medications, and put the bags in the cabinet for anyone to hang. The person who died was his colleague, an anesthesiologist, who took an IV bag home with her. She wasn't feeling well. She felt like she was dehydrated. She took one of his special bags, hooked up an IV to herself, and was dead in her chair. The other 11 people who received these IV bags had cardiac emergencies during surgery, and they were sent to ICU, and ultimately they survived. He is facing a sentence of up to 190 years in prison. Lucy Letby is a British nurse who was discovered to be causing infants in the neonatal unit to die from insulin injections, overfeeding, assault, and creating air embolism. She found her need to confess and wrote in her diary that she was doing these things. She accepted responsibility for these. Her writings were discovered, and that became part of the evidence against her. A British jury deliberated for 22 years and found her guilty of killing 7 infants, 7 counts of attempted murder for 6 infants, and there was no verdict of 6 counts of attempted murder of 4 infants. And now I'd like to share with you a little bit about what happened in Somerset Medical Center, in New Jersey, and across the country as a result of the Charles Cullen experience. Somerset Medical Center brought me in to teach a program on documentation to the nursing and physician staff. I had gotten a call from Mary Lund prior to Charles' arrest. She had called me in the beginning of the year and said, I'd like to have you do this program. And then she put it on hold and she said, there's something going on in the hospital. We need to postpone this. I went in after this arrest occurred and taught the program. And I will share with you in just a minute the video that she created for me after I gave that presentation. And you'll have a chance to see Mary Lund and what she said about that experience.
It was important to us at our hospital to have our clinical staff educated regarding the impact of their documentation to future potential litigation. We asked Pat to come and address our staff on her experiences as a legal nurse consultant and basically give us some insight into how our documentation can protect the healthcare provider and the hospital in the future. We found the presentation very helpful. We had 2 sessions. We have counted 108 people in attendance, which is a remarkable feat for getting people to attend in services within the hospital. It is a subject that our staff are hungry for a better understanding of. I think it will affect how they go back to work. Specifically, I think it will raise their awareness about their role and responsibilities in keeping an accurate record of their interaction with patients, their families, and the other healthcare providers. And I think it will increase their awareness of following a chain of command. I think that was a very important message that got put across today. Pat was able to relate to the audience, questions were generated, and I think it was very successful.
As a result of what happened with Charles Cullen, now that you've had a chance to meet Mary Lund, I wanted to share with you what happened in New Jersey, specifically in the rest of the country as a result of him. The Cullen Act, which is a patient safety act, was put in place that mandated that employers were required to report any employee impairment, incompetence, or professional misconduct that affected patient safety. And they were to inquire about other disciplinary and employment issues. They were further required to ask potential employees who were being hired about issues associated with misconduct, patient safety, or any of those issues. And this information had to be returned before they could be employed. Ultimately, 35 other states in the United States have followed suit to make it more transparent in terms of former employees, so that somebody thinking of hiring that person wouldn't receive a person on their staff who had this trail of incidents following them. Charles was asked, what do you think should have been done or should be done to make it safer in healthcare. And he provided 6 recommendations. One, that there should be surveillance cameras in medication storage rooms. Second, that RN should use swipe cards to access drugs. Third, that there should be a barcode on lethal drugs to track their usage. And that there should be, number 4, daily counting of all potentially lethal drugs, just like we do with narcotics. The 5th recommendation was that hospitals should be allowed to share employee information. And finally, there should be a national database, updated employment histories of healthcare workers. Now, we have some of these recommendations in place, although not all. But you can see where his thought process was and how he knew from his experience the holes in the system that he was able to take advantage of in order to leave a path of destruction. When I read his interview with the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, I remember him saying, "I killed people on an average of once a month, but I don't know how many there were." Once he was imprisoned, the detective sat down with him with boxes and boxes and boxes of medical records and spent almost a year going through the records, asking Charles to identify the people he had killed. We will never know what that number is. Stay tuned and find out what's coming up on Legal Nurse Podcast on our next episode. And thank you for watching this on our YouTube channel, Legal Nurse Business, or listening to it on audio channels. Coming up next, you'll have an opportunity to get a peek into a world of travel nursing when you hear from Cameron Totman, who has extensive experience as a travel nurse and is a medical surgical expert witness. Cameron, tell our viewer or our listener, what were some of the topics that we covered in your podcast?
Sure. We spoke about travel nursing, what it is. We talked about how long a typical assignment is. We talked about learning how a travel nurse can learn a facility's regulations. We talked about the fluctuation in pay. We talked about the fact that a travel nurse needs to be adaptable to nuanced situations. A travel nurse is oftentimes considered a leader among the workforce. We also spoke heavily about medical errors and patient safety risks.
We covered a lot, and you'll want to hear what Cameron has to say on this topic by watching for his podcast, Cameron Totman, coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast. Join us then. I hope you got some great tips from this program. Be sure to check out our 3-day conference coming up May 30, 31, and June 1st on murder. If you see this podcast after those dates, you can go to the link below the video, lnc.tips/murder, and get the recordings for the conference. Use those to build your knowledge about forensic cases. And I'll see you on the next show.